Shavua Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Kilayim. We're up to Perek Tet Mishnah Zayin. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat Neria Ben Svetlana Ranbayv Minuchatu Bagan Eden. Amen. Now Rabotai, today's Mishnah is going to discuss if a person buys a garment that might have shatnez in it, he may not wear it until he makes sure that it has no shatnez. So the Mishnah now is going to discuss certain items that have to be checked before being worn. Habarsin v'abardisin. Barsin and bardisin, the Rab tells us there are various types of woolen bed sheets. One of them is thick, one of them is thin. Dalmatikyon. Dalmatikyon is a type of long woolen underwear. Umin alot, pinon, and pinon shoes, which again, the Rab tells us, a type of shoes made from inferior wool. Lo yilbash ben ad she'ivdok. A person may not wear these garments until he checks to make sure that they do not have shatnez. Why? The Farshim explained to us, since these specific woolen items are often sewed with linen thread, a person cannot wear them until he makes sure that there is no shatnez. And the Farshim explained to us that even though barsin and bardisin are bed sheets that are not worn, they're simply used to lie down upon, they cannot be used if they contain shatnez, like we learned earlier in Mishnah Bet, that midrabanan, the rabbis say you cannot lay down on mats and cushions that are made of shatnez if the skin touches them, because out of concern it might get stuck onto your body and then become shatnez. Now, other woolen garments, they do not have to be checked according to the Mishnah. In the time of the Mishnah, why? Linen thread was not commonly used, and it could be assumed that the woolen garment didn't have any linen in it, with the exception of the items specifically listed in the Mishnah. Nowadays, the Mefarshim tell us where linen is more commonly available, most woolen garments have to be checked to make sure that they do not have linen in it. That is how the Rab explains to us the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi says, if these items come from coastal areas overseas, they don't require checking. And when the Rab explained what does it mean coastal areas overseas, places located outside of Eretz Yisrael, because when we say overseas, we're referring to again places outside of Eretz Yisrael, as the Rashi tells us in Masechet Gittin, page 2a. So again, Rabbi Yossi says, if these items come from the coastal areas overseas, they don't require checking, because it can be assumed that they are made with hemp and not linen. And Mefarshim explained to us, because in these areas linen were very expensive and they were rarely used, so people instead would sew their garments with hemp. Therefore, there is no concern that they are shatnez. The Rav does tell us, Mishnah zu nishnet barishona, again, like we just said, this Mishnah was originally taught in the previous times, when linen wasn't as common, but nowadays the linen is more common. All woolen garments required to be checked. Therefore, a person who buys a sewn garment from a non-Jew nowadays, he's not allowed to wear it until he does a very scrupulous, precise checking. Another case, the Mishnah says, you can assume that a zered boot, many different versions of the Mishnah say zered instead of zered, but we have zered. So you can assume that a zered boot, what is a zered boot? It's a type of wool-lined boot. Wool-lined boot. You can assume that it does not have kilayim. Why? Because it's generally not made with linen. Again, Rabotai, zered is a wool-lined boot. It does not, we don't have to assume it has kilayim, because generally it was not made with linen. Therefore, a person can wear it without checking it for shatnez. And that's what the Rab tells us. And we do not have a concern that maybe linen was lined in it. That is an Abotai of Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chet is going to teach us a very important rule in shatnez. Wool and linen are only forbidden as shatnez if they're combined in a specific way. And the Mishnah will explain to us, but Rabotai, as a background, the standard way that you make a garment is to take raw material like wool, linen, or cotton, you comb it, you spin it into thread, and then you weave that thread with other thread into cloth, which can be fashioned into a garment. Shatnez applies according to the Torah law only when you follow this exact procedure. Now, the Mefarshim do tell us that if wool and linen were sewed together with a firm stitch, that would be shatnez just like it was woven. So the Mishnah tells us, that was the background. The Mishnah tells us, En isu mishum kilayim ela tavui va'arog. A fabric is not prohibited as kilayim unless it's made of wool and linen threads that were both spun and woven, meaning the wool and the linen were spun into thread, each on their own, and then the threads were woven together into a cloth. However, if you had these procedures separately, meaning you didn't have one or the other, however, if wool and linen were not spun into a thread, but they were woven together in their unfinished states, the combination is not shatnez. Likewise, if you took wool and linen and you spun them into thread, but you did not weave them together, but you just pressed them together, that is not shatnez as well. And the Mishnah tells us how it knows this halakha. Shneimar, the pasuk says in Sefer Dvarim, Lo tilbash shatnez. You shall not wear shatnez. Shatnez is the word is broken up into three words. Davar shua tavui v'noz. Something that is shua, smooth, tavui, spun, and noz, woven. That's how shatnez can be read. Shua tavui v'noz. And this teaches us that in order to be subject to the prohibition of shatnez, it has to be both spinning and weaving as well as smoothing. And only then can a garment be considered shatnez. Mefarshim explained to us, that when fibers of wool or linen are raw, they are tangled together. So before spinning them into thread, they have to be smoothened, usually by combing. Now, even though the Mishnah didn't mention this earlier, it adds now that the threads have to be made from smooth wool in order to create shatnez. If you took uncombed wool and linen and spun them into thread and wove them together, it is not shatnez. Even though the Mishnah didn't tell us earlier, it's telling us now. It has to be smooth, then spun, and then woven together in order to be shatnez. All these three things. Now the Mishnah continues to teach us about the severity of the sin of shatnez from this word. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, a person who wears shatnez, naloz umelizhu et aviv shebashamayim alav. He turns away from the correct path and he causes his Father in heaven to turn away from him. How do we know this? We get this from the final syllable of the word shatnez. Nez is similar to the word naloz, which means to turn away, and meliz to cause others to turn away. So by wearing shatnez, a person shows that he is turning away from Hashem and rebelling against him. So in response, Hashem turns away from the person and doesn't show him mercy. Now, how does a person who wears shatnez show that he's rebelling against God? So the Mefarshim explain that shatnez specifically, more than other sins, shows rebellion against God. Why? Because unlike other sins, shatnez is not usually motivated by a physical desire. Why? Because a person doesn't generally derive more pleasure from a shatnez garment than a non-shatnez garment. So from the fact that he wears shatnez, it's simply because he disregards Hashem's command. And that, God forbid, causes Hashem to turn away from the person and not show him mercy. May we all be zocher rabotai to make sure that we check our clothing for shatnez and we avoid this horrible, severe sin. That is the end, rabotai, of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody shall have a Shavua Tov. Baruch Adonai leolam. Amen v'amen.